Rachel Santos had spent 13 years trying to forget the combat insertions, the hostile landings, and the special operations missions over enemy territory. Until terrorists hijacked her humanitarian cargo flight over Africa, and she became the only pilot in that airspace who could fight back while flying a fully loaded MC-130 Hercules. Welcome to Daily Story. Before we dive into this extraordinary tale of aviation courage and hidden special operations expertise, tell us in the comments what city you're watching from today. And if you believe stories like these deserve to be told, hit that subscribe button to join our community. Humanitarian cargo operations represented one of aviation's most challenging and least celebrated missions. Flying aging transport aircraft into remote regions with minimal infrastructure, delivering medical supplies and food aid to populations facing crisis, and operating in airspace where political instability made every flight a calculated risk. Global Relief Aviation operated a small fleet of C-130 Hercules transport aircraft dedicated to humanitarian missions across Africa, South Asia, and Latin America. The organization flew where commercial carriers wouldn't operate, landed on dirt strips that barely qualified as runways, and transported cargo that could mean the difference between survival and catastrophe for isolated communities. The C-130 Hercules had served as the workhorse of military transport aviation for over 60 years, renowned for its ability to operate from unprepared surfaces, carry massive payloads, and survive conditions that would ground more sophisticated aircraft. Civilian versions served humanitarian organizations that needed the C-130's unique capabilities to reach populations that conventional aviation couldn't serve. Captain Rachel Santos had flown for Global Relief Aviation for 11 years, commanding C-130s on routes that crossed some of the world's most unstable regions. At 45, she had logged over 15,000 flight hours in transport aircraft, earning a reputation as one of the organization's most capable pilots who could land anywhere, fly through any weather, and deliver cargo to populations that desperately needed what she carried. Her colleagues knew her as the pilot who never refused a mission, who could navigate through weather systems that kept other aircraft grounded, and who somehow always found ways to land on strips that looked impossible from the air. She spoke with the clipped precision of someone accustomed to emergency communications, used aviation terminology with military exactness, and flew with smoothness that made even severe turbulence feel manageable. Ground crews and aid workers trusted Rachel completely. When she said she could make the flight, they knew their supplies would reach their destination. When she said conditions were too dangerous, they knew that attempting the mission would be suicidal. Her judgment was absolute, her flying was flawless, and her dedication to humanitarian service was unwavering. Rachel lived in a small apartment in Nairobi when not flying, which was rare. Cargo pilots spent most of their lives either in the air or preparing for the next flight. Her few personal possessions included photographs of aircraft she had flown, navigation charts from remote airstrips around the world, and a locked footlocker containing items she rarely opened but couldn't discard. What Rachel's colleagues didn't know, what Global Relief Aviation couldn't have suspected from her employment history, was that Major Rachel Santos, United States Air Force, had spent 17 years as one of America's most accomplished special operations pilots. She had flown MC-130 Combat Talon aircraft with the 1st Special Operations Wing, conducting missions that inserted special forces teams into hostile territory, extracted personnel from combat zones, and performed aviation operations that required capabilities few pilots possessed. Her military career included over 3,000 hours of special operations flying, participation in classified missions across 3 continents, and expertise in tactical aviation that remained among the most demanding specialties in Air Force operations. Rachel's special operations background included night vision goggle flying at extremely low altitudes, precision navigation without GPS in denied airspace, combat landings on unimproved surfaces under hostile fire, and the kind of situational awareness that allowed pilots to execute missions where any mistake would be fatal. The MC-130 Combat Talon represented the most sophisticated variant of the Hercules aircraft, equipped with terrain-following radar, defensive systems, and capabilities that allowed it to penetrate enemy airspace and deliver special operations forces with precision that conventional transport aircraft couldn't achieve. The transition from Air Force special operations to humanitarian cargo flying had been part of a carefully planned career change. After 17 years of missions that included constant danger and regular exposure to hostile fire, Rachel had chosen work that used her aviation skills to save lives through medical supplies and food aid rather than military operations. Her apartment's locked footlocker contained memorabilia from her Air Force career, photographs of her MC-130 on classified missions, commendations for operations she couldn't discuss openly, and navigation logs from airspace where American military aircraft weren't supposed to operate. Her bookshelf held manuals on special operations aviation, tactical navigation, and combat flying that represented 17 years of mastering one of the most demanding professions in military aviation. Rachel had found satisfaction in work that used her flying skills to help humanitarian organizations rather than military forces. Each mission brought familiar challenges: difficult navigation, challenging landing sites, unpredictable weather, but her cargo was medical supplies and food rather than military equipment, and the people she served were civilians facing crisis rather than combat forces. The morning of July 18 started with a routine humanitarian mission. Flight 2847 would carry 28,000 pounds of medical supplies from Nairobi to a refugee camp in South Sudan, where ongoing conflict had created a humanitarian crisis affecting over 100,000 displaced civilians. Rachel's MC-130 was loaded with antibiotics, surgical equipment, and emergency medical supplies that could prevent disease outbreaks in overcrowded refugee conditions. Rachel completed her pre-flight checks with systematic efficiency developed through thousands of transport missions. Her co-pilot was James Mitchell, a former commercial airline pilot with 12,000 hours who had been flying humanitarian missions for 5 years. "Rachel, we're showing weather building along the route," Mitchell reported. "Thunderstorm cells developing over the Sud region." Rachel reviewed weather data with expertise that went beyond standard commercial aviation training. "We can navigate around the worst cells. The refugees need these supplies. People are dying from treatable infections because previous deliveries were delayed." At 8:15 a.m., Flight 2847 lifted off from Nairobi's Wilson Airport on what should have been a routine 3-hour humanitarian flight. Rachel climbed to cruise altitude of 25,000 feet, established navigation to South Sudan, and was reviewing fuel calculations when her cargo compartment alarm activated. "Captain, we have a situation in the cargo bay," the loadmaster's voice came through the intercom with barely controlled panic. "Multiple armed individuals just emerged from the cargo containers. They have weapons and they're moving toward the cockpit." Rachel's blood ran cold. 13 years of humanitarian flying had prepared her for mechanical emergencies, weather challenges, and difficult landing conditions. But the possibility of hijacking existed in a different category, a threat that required responses that civilian pilots weren't trained to execute. "Copy that. How many individuals and what type of weapons?" "At least 4 that I can see, Captain. They have automatic rifles, and one appears to have explosives." Rachel immediately switched her radio to the emergency frequency. "Nairobi Control, this is Global Relief 2847 declaring an emergency. We have a hijacking in progress with multiple armed hostiles aboard. Request immediate military response." The response from Air Traffic Control came with controlled urgency. "Global Relief 2847, copy hijacking emergency. Stand by for military coordination. Maintain current heading and altitude." In the cargo compartment behind her, the situation was deteriorating rapidly. The loadmaster reported that the hijackers had concealed themselves inside cargo containers that were supposed to contain only medical supplies, using the humanitarian mission as cover to hijack the aircraft. "Captain, they're trying to breach the cockpit door," Mitchell reported, his voice steady despite the situation. "That door won't hold long if they have tools or explosives." Rachel made rapid calculations based on 17 years of tactical aviation training. They were 180 miles from Nairobi, 120 miles from the South Sudan border, and the hijackers were attempting to gain control of the aircraft. Standard protocol called for maintaining level flight and allowing military response to develop, but her tactical assessment told her that waiting meant allowing the hijackers time to achieve their objectives. Her radio activated with a new voice. "Global Relief 2847, this is Nairobi Control. Be advised Kenyan Air Force is scrambling fighters to intercept your position. ETA 12 minutes. Maintain current course and altitude." 12 minutes. Rachel knew from experience that 12 minutes was an eternity in tactical aviation. The hijackers would breach the cockpit long before fighter escort arrived, and once they controlled the aircraft, the situation would escalate from hijacking to a potential weapon of mass destruction. "Nairobi Control, Global Relief 2847. The hijackers are attempting a cockpit breach with what sounds like explosive charges. I'm going to need operational flexibility if they gain entry." Global Relief 2847, negative. You are directed to maintain level flight. Military response is en route. Rachel looked at Mitchell, who had been monitoring the cargo compartment situation while she coordinated with air traffic control. "James, those hijackers are going to breach this door in the next 2 minutes. When they do, they'll either kill us and fly this aircraft themselves, or they'll force us to fly it where they want." "What are you thinking, Captain?" Rachel made a decision based on 17 years of special operations training and absolute certainty that waiting meant allowing terrorists to turn her aircraft into a weapon. "I'm thinking that if they get through that door, I'm not going to make it easy for them to control this aircraft." The cockpit door shuddered under impacts that suggested the hijackers were using explosive charges to compromise the locks. Rachel disengaged the autopilot and placed her hands on the flight controls for the first time since reaching cruise altitude. James, when that door breaches, I'm going to make this C-130 unflyable for anyone who doesn't have special operations training. Get on the radio and tell Nairobi that we're going evasive. Mitchell understood immediately what Rachel was proposing, using the C-130's flight capabilities to create conditions that would prevent hijackers from controlling the aircraft. Captain, transport aircraft aren't designed for tactical maneuvering.
I know.
But neither are hijackers trained to fly during combat maneuvers. The cockpit door lock failed with an explosive crack. Four men pushed through, brandishing AK-47 rifles and shouting commands in Arabic. The lead hijacker pointed his weapon at Rachel while screaming demands. What happened next would later be analyzed by aviation safety investigators, military tacticians, and counterterrorism experts as one of the most extraordinary examples of using transport aircraft capabilities to defeat a hijacking attempt. Rachel threw the C-130 into a series of maneuvers that transport aircraft rarely performed but that special operations pilots executed routinely during tactical flying. She rolled the aircraft 45 degrees while simultaneously pulling back on the controls, creating G-forces that threw the standing hijackers across the cockpit and pinned them against the bulkheads. Nairobi Control, Global Relief 2847, has initiated defensive maneuvering. Hijackers are in the cockpit, but I'm preventing them from gaining control. Colonel James Harrison, commanding the Kenyan Air Force Quick Reaction Alert fighters scrambled from Moi Air Base, was monitoring the emergency frequency when he heard Rachel's transmission. He watched his radar display show the C-130's flight path suddenly deviate from straight and level flight into maneuvers that transport aircraft almost never perform. Nairobi Control, Falcon Lead. We're showing Global Relief 2847 executing what appears to be tactical defensive flying. Can you confirm the pilot's background? Falcon Lead, negative information on pilot background beyond civilian cargo operations. Harrison accelerated his F-5 fighter to maximum speed, covering the remaining distance to the C-130's position in 4 minutes. When he pulled alongside the transport aircraft, what he saw made him immediately radio his wingman. Falcon 2, that C-130 is flying special operations maneuvers. The pilot knows tactical aviation. Inside the C-130, Rachel was executing a defensive flight profile that drew on 17 years of special operations experience. She couldn't fight the hijackers physically in close quarters, but she could make the aircraft's flight environment so chaotic that they couldn't stand, couldn't coordinate, and couldn't effectively threaten her or Mitchell. She rolled the aircraft left, then right, maintaining just enough control to prevent structural damage while creating conditions that threw the hijackers around the cockpit like rag dolls. When one managed to grab a seat and stabilize himself enough to raise his weapon toward Mitchell, Rachel executed a negative G pushover that lifted him off the floor and slammed him into the ceiling. Captain, Mitchell shouted over the chaos, we have military escort. Kenyan fighters just pulled alongside. Rachel maintained her defensive maneuvering while checking her position. The F-5 fighters were visible through her cockpit windows, matching her erratic flight path with precision. Her radio activated with Harrison's voice. Global Relief 2847, this is Falcon Lead. We're alongside to assist. What's your situation? Falcon Lead, Global Relief 2847. I have 4 hijackers in the cockpit, but I'm maintaining control through defensive flying. I need you to coordinate an emergency landing at the nearest secure military field. Global Relief 2847, copy. The nearest suitable field is Moi Air Base. We'll escort you in. Can you maintain control? Rachel executed another defensive roll that threw the lead hijacker across the cockpit. Affirmative, Falcon Lead. I can maintain this as long as necessary. Harrison studied the C-130's maneuvering and suddenly understood what he was witnessing. Global Relief 2847, this is Falcon Lead. That's Special Operations Tactical Flying. Where did you learn those maneuvers? Falcon Lead, I flew MC-130s with Air Force Special Operations Command. 17 years, 1st Special Operations Wing out of Hurlburt Field. Harrison's response came with recognition and respect. Global Relief 2847, Falcon Lead copies. Former Special Ops pilot here too. Maintain your defensive pattern. We'll clear you for priority landing at Moi. Ground response is being positioned. For the next 15 minutes, Rachel maintained defensive maneuvering that prevented the hijackers from coordinating any effective action while slowly descending toward Moi Air Base. The 28 aid workers in the cargo compartment endured a flight experience that varied between terrifying and nauseating, but Rachel's primary concern was preventing the hijackers from gaining control. Harrison and his wingman maintained close escort, ready to take more aggressive action if Rachel's defensive flying failed to maintain control. But as they watched the C-130 execute maneuvers that pushed the limits of transport aircraft design, both fighter pilots recognized they were witnessing extraordinary airmanship. Nairobi Control, Falcon Lead. That cargo pilot is executing special operations defensive flying that I've only seen in combat training. She's maintaining perfect aircraft control while creating conditions that completely disable the hijacking attempt. Rachel lined up for landing at Moi Air Base, where Kenyan military tactical teams were positioned. She executed one final defensive maneuver that threw all 4 hijackers to the cockpit floor, then transitioned to a stable approach that brought the C-130 to a perfect touchdown despite 15 minutes of extreme maneuvering. The moment the aircraft stopped, tactical teams stormed aboard and secured the hijackers, who were disoriented, injured, and completely defeated by 15 minutes of flying that had prevented them from achieving any of their objectives. Rachel shut down the engines, completed her shutdown checklist with mechanical precision, and finally allowed herself to acknowledge the trembling in her hands that came from 15 minutes of maximum stress flying. Kenyan Intelligence Service agent David Kamani boarded the aircraft and found Rachel sitting in the captain's seat, still wearing her headset, eyes focused on the instrument panel as if the flight were still continuing. Captain Santos, I'm Agent Kamani, Kenyan Intelligence. Are you injured? Rachel finally looked up, her eyes showing the exhaustion of someone who had just experienced combat. No. The aid workers in the cargo bay. Medical teams are checking everyone now. Preliminary reports show some injuries from the turbulence, but no serious casualties. Captain, I need to understand what happened here. The military pilots are reporting that you executed special operations maneuvers that civilian cargo pilots aren't trained to perform. Rachel removed her headset and stood slowly, her legs unsteady after 15 minutes of maximum stress flying. Agent Kamani, I'm a former Air Force Special Operations pilot. When those hijackers breached my cockpit, I used the only defensive capability I had, making this aircraft unflyable for anyone without special operations training. Captain, you not only saved 28 aid workers but also prevented what intelligence suggests was a planned attack using your aircraft as a weapon. We're going to need a full debriefing on your background and capabilities. 3 days later, Rachel found herself in a secure conference room at the U.S. Embassy in Nairobi with American and Kenyan officials, military representatives, and humanitarian organization leadership. Captain Santos, U.S. Defense Attaché Colonel Patricia Hayes began. Your actions during the hijacking of Flight 2847 prevented what intelligence agencies have confirmed was a terrorist plot to use your aircraft in an attack on a refugee camp. However, your defensive flying capabilities raise questions about how a civilian humanitarian pilot possesses special operations aviation skills. Rachel had spent 3 days reviewing her decisions and remained convinced she had chosen the only viable course of action. Colonel, when terrorists breached my cockpit, standard protocols no longer applied. I made a tactical decision to use capabilities from 17 years of Air Force Special Operations to prevent hijackers from controlling my aircraft. Lieutenant General Samuel Omondi, representing the Kenyan Defense Forces, spoke next. Captain Santos, we've reviewed your flight profile during the hijacking. You executed defensive maneuvers that are taught in special operations schools but aren't part of any civilian aviation training program. Your tactical flying prevented a catastrophic terrorist attack on a refugee camp sheltering over 100,000 civilians. General, I did what my training prepared me to do. 17 years of special operations experience gave me capabilities that I hoped never to use in humanitarian aviation. The investigation concluded that Rachel had acted appropriately given the extraordinary circumstances, and international aviation authorities amended regulations to clarify that pilots were authorized to use any necessary measures to prevent hijackers from controlling aircraft. 6 months later, Captain Rachel Santos was still flying humanitarian missions for global relief aviation, but now her expertise was being used to develop security training for humanitarian aviation operations, and she had established consultation with U.S. Africa Command on aviation security in conflict zones. She continued flying C-130s to remote areas where humanitarian aid was desperately needed, but now she also trained other humanitarian pilots on defensive flying techniques adapted from military special operations, creating capabilities that could protect both aircraft and the critical aid they carried. The cargo pilot who delivered medical supplies was also the special operations veteran who had demonstrated the humanitarian aircraft could be defended by pilots whose training exceeded standard civilian requirements. Rachel had learned that leaving Air Force Special Operations didn't mean abandoning tactical aviation expertise. It meant finding ways to use that knowledge to protect humanitarian missions while maintaining the civilian career she had chosen after 17 years of military service. So now I ask you, have you ever known a cargo pilot, humanitarian worker, or aviation professional whose capabilities seemed to exceed what their job required? Someone who handled extreme situations with tactical precision, suggesting much more demanding previous training? Share their story in the comments below. And if this story moved you, hit that subscribe button and join the Daily Story community. We're here to honor the pilots, the special operations veterans, the people who dedicate their lives to serving others through skills most of us can only imagine. Thank you for watching, and remember, some of the most capable pilots in the world aren't flying military missions anymore. They're delivering hope to people who need it most, while quietly maintaining readiness to protect their aircraft and passengers using expertise that exists at the intersection of humanitarian service and special operations mastery.